This is WMVS Milwaukee.
We expect it to snow during winter in Milwaukee, but one particular snowstorm will always stand out in our city's history. Here to discuss the big blizzard of 1947 are Paul Joseph, WTMJ's chief meteorologist, and Professor Donald Newman of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. My special guests on the next I Remember Milwaukee. Hi, I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to I Remember Milwaukee. Joining me tonight are Paul Joseph, chief meteorologist for WTMJ, and Professor Donald Newman of University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Now, 50 years ago, a blizzard shut down Milwaukee and the surrounding areas. And everybody who experienced it will never forget that snow, that truly incredible amount of snow. Tonight, we remember, as the title of a book by Professor Newman suggests, When the Trolleys Were Stopped Cold, the Great Snowstorm of '47. Take a look.
It was January 29th and 30th, 1947, when a 60-mile-per-hour blizzard imprisoned the city, shut it down, locked it up, stopped its plows, closed its streets, stranded its people, and made it tough for some of us to even open our doors to get outside. The storm had sealed off Milwaukee.
This is how Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel columnist Bill Jans recorded his memories of the blizzard of '47 on its 50th anniversary. Jans was 9 years old at the time. He and many others recall that the storm started slowly on a Tuesday evening. Weather forecasters predicted an inch or so of snow, but by the next afternoon it was clear this was some snowstorm. By the time it ended, more than 18 inches of snow had fallen, made worse by high winds. Many people were stranded for days at a time. Cars clogged streets, stopping the only other available transportation, buses and trolley cars. The train station became an emergency shelter. Suddenly, food and fuel were in short supply.
We lived in an apartment house in which there were 6 apartments, very small building, and we were running out of fuel. And coal trucks could not get into us. They would get stuck. There was no way of getting into the apartment building. So everyone in the apartment got out, got their shovels, went outside, and shoveled out part of the alley, and then shoveled the street to Juneau Avenue, which was the main street closest to us, which had been, eventually was plowed, but this was several days later. I'm dating myself, but there were no snow blowers in those days. You did everything by hand. I said that you had to do it yourself, and neighbors helped us. It was one of the strangest scenes, I think, sights I've ever seen. There are all these people including kids, 6, 7, 8-year-old. My sister was younger than I was, and she helped. We were shoveling the street onto the sidewalk so a coal truck could get in, and we had turned on the thermostats, and it was freezing.
And it was blowing so hard, and I guess because the city didn't have the equipment to remove the snow, made it a little bit more exciting, because how were they going to get rid of all this stuff? Oh, another thing that my mother and I did, we took the sled and we walked down to 30th and North, where Golden Guernsey had their distribution plant, to get milk. And I'm sure they were glad to get rid of the milk as we were to get the milk. Our next-door neighbor was expecting a baby, and we were all kind of worried about her, what she was going to do. And when the time came, her husband just plopped her on the sled and took her up to St. Joseph's Hospital, which was 12 blocks down Burleigh Street, and she delivered a baby on February 2nd.
People remembered neighbors pitching in, not only to shovel, but to provide food and hot coffee to those stuck in streetcars and buses. Newspaper headlines reported the storm had paralyzed the city. Factories, schools, stores all shut down. The blizzard was blamed for 5 deaths. But others now think of the unexpected snowstorm as an adventure. It has a place in Milwaukee's history, and it has changed the way the city handles modern-day snow emergencies.
Nobody who went through that can ever forget it. Don, we've seen how bad it got. Was the city really that closed down?
Oh, absolutely. As far as I could tell from my house, there wasn't a thing moving anywhere. And that was for at least 2 to 2.5 days.
And you lived where?
We lived on the west side, right across from Sherman Park. My dad was returning home from work Wednesday night of the snowstorm, and his truck got stuck about a mile from our house. He managed to trudge home, and then 2 days later, he and I started walking with shovels on our backs to try to dig his truck out. And I had a pretty horrible experience, as a matter of fact, because we were walking through Sherman Park at that point, and a very large dog that had been out in the storm, apparently without any food,
Ooh.
and very, very vicious, as a matter of fact, charged at me. And I remember my dad thought very quickly and actually swung the shovel as though it were a bat, hit the dog on the side of the head, and he went yapping off. And to this day, I am apprehensive about large dogs.
Especially when they haven't eaten for a while.
That's right.
Jim, I have to point out that I have no remembrance of the storm. I'm much too young, of course.
Yes, we will.
No.
Because the next question is, why wasn't this predicted? And I do want to mention that Paul was not the chief meteorologist at WTMJ in 1947.
Actually, I was 1 year old, and I didn't live in this area. But it's interesting, the storm, when I did a little research, I was contacted by UWM for a special symposium that they held on the storm. This is the 50th anniversary. And I tried to find out if the storm was predicted. And it was kind of difficult. I called the National Weather Service, and first of all, I wanted to check the meteorology of the storm, what caused the storm. And they were really nice to send me some maps and charts to kind of give me a view as to what caused the big snowstorm of '47. But then when I said, do you have a record of your forecast? Very quickly they said, nope.
Oh,
so
my.
What I had to do was I got some
So you're not the only one that buries his bad
No,
forecast.
that's not true, no. What I had to do is I got copies of some old Milwaukee journals and Milwaukee Sentinels. You can see some of them here.
Let's get that so we can get a shot of it. Right up here is the weather forecast. And what does that say?
Which one are you looking at here? Sunny and warm? No, that's later on in the... Actually, this was the 27th. That was the Monday, and by then they weren't even thinking of the storm on Monday. Actually, the storm itself began, and correct me if I'm wrong, Don, it was Tuesday evening, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
5:55.
The
Happen to have that down. And it really didn't start as a big storm, did it?
No, it was just a little, about an inch of snow fell between 6 o'clock in the evening and 2:30 in the morning, and then it stopped.
And that's, as I remember, about what was, and I don't remember this, from the fact that I memorized the weather forecast, although I blush to admit that I am old enough to have memories of the storm. But there was, I think they said about an inch of snow.
An inch or so of snow was the forecast, that's right. That was the night before the storm. Actually, the night that the storm began, that was the forecast.
So, Don, it started on Tuesday night.
Evening, the 28th.
And then stopped.
Yes, and that's what really messed things up, because they would normally have mounted plows on the front of the garbage trucks, which they used to push the plows, but because it had stopped. And the weather forecast said there would be an inch of snow. They had an inch of snow. They said, send out the garbage trucks to collect garbage.
But they didn't listen to the revised forecast.
Right.
Because...
No, there really was?
Well, the next day. I mean, once it was, there was heavy snow falling, then...
Well, then you would know. I mean,
then they wouldn't know the extent of it, and then the Weather Bureau caught on to the storm and predicted quite a snowfall that day. And what I thought was interesting, now, Don, you were here at that time, right? There seemed to be a lot more tolerance to weather forecasts back then. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Is this a tad self-serving, Mr. Joseph?
No. What I mean is, reading the newspaper of the day, actually it's the 30th, the day of the 30th, the Morning Sentinel, the newspaper from 1947 on that day said, the predicted 10 inches of snow fell, and even more is coming. And so actually, they took the revised forecast, and that was the prediction for the storm. I thought that was very tolerant. What do you think?
Sneaky little rascals.
I suppose it was. Actually, the snow began with a real vengeance at about 9 o'clock in the morning on the 29th.
Mm-hmm.
And it became clear almost immediately that it wasn't going to be a 1-inch snowstorm. But they just didn't know quite what to do. And by the time some decisions were made, it was really too late, because cars were bogged down in the snow, buses were bogged down in the snow, facing in all directions. So even if they could get the garbage trucks back to mount the plows, there was no way to get them out into the street to do any good anyway. They had one V plow, I mean, one really effective plow in the whole city, because for about 10 years they had spent almost nil on snow clearing equipment.
We've got some actual footage from 1947. Now, this is the clear-up. We didn't have any footage of the actual storm itself. And we can take a look at that, and I think we can talk over it as we're going along, but you can get an idea as to what those plows look like.
Yes, this is a truck that dates back to the 20s. They forced it into service. But notice that's a straight plow.
Right. And you notice also
those plows do nothing. I mean, they just pile the snow up in front, and then...
And he's got to back up and keep going.
Back up and hit it hard. This is on Lincoln Avenue on the south side.
Now, look at the size of those drifts.
Well,
those are grown-up people, folks.
Yeah.
And people trying to... I can remember people trying to shovel out. Now, my clearest memory of this is kind of an odd one, because my mother predicted this storm.
Oh, no.
Yes,
Really?
my mother, who was later burned as a witch in Salem.
Me?
Yeah, she grew up in Portland, Maine, and I remember this very clearly, that she went around to the neighbors, and she said, there's a blizzard coming. And they said, well, they predicted just a little bit of snowpat. She said, no. She said, I grew up with blizzards, and this is going to be a blizzard. And nobody listened to her. She was Cassandra-like. And so she went out, and she stockpiled... Remember those old Swanson canned chickens? And we had those in the house, and we had all sorts of canned goods and vegetables, and we ate fine, and everybody else was eating cornflakes because nobody could get to the store.
This was inspiration, or did she have... some people, you know, that have some medical problems sometimes can
not
feel
as far as
changes in the weather.
Not that she would ever admit to.
Oh.
No, I think it was just something that she felt from growing up with real storms. And how much snow did we actually have? Does either of you...
The official snowfall was 18 inches over the 3-day period.
Now, that's not a lot of snow.
Well, that's a...
But we could handle 18 inches. But wasn't it the wind that really caused the trouble?
The wind off the lake was reported to, I've seen different numbers, as high as 60 miles an hour, roughly 50 miles an hour, and piled huge drifts. A woman whom I met just about a week ago told me she was living in a trailer. There were lots of trailer parks at the time because it was just after World War II. They had not built as many houses as was necessary. She said the next morning, after the snow had actually abated a bit, she opened her door and she couldn't see anything. There was just snow right up to the top of the door. So she took a spoon and started trying to dig out.
With a spoon?
With a spoon. She had nothing else. And she was just hung up there for a period of a day or so. Finally, her husband made it back and dug from the outside. But, I mean, these were drifts. I personally remember jumping off the second floor porch in our house into a drift that was not 2 feet beneath where the porch ended. So,
real strong northeast winds. It was a panhandle hook. That's what I discovered through my research. It was actually a pretty textbook model. It was a low that came out of the southwest down into Oklahoma and Texas and swung right up through the northern or north central part of Illinois and actually slowed down. That helped to give us the excess of snow because, Don, isn't it true that the snow was over like a 2.5 day period?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, do we still have storms like that? Is that panhandle hook something that happens?
Oh, yeah. That's a frequent way that we get heavy snow in Milwaukee. In fact, you know, it's interesting how people remember weather, and they really do. The collective memory of this particular storm, and I'm sure people who weren't around in 47 remember many storms after 1947. This is just one that sticks in the minds of people who were there at that time.
I think because it closed the city, and I don't remember any other storm just absolutely socking us. We've got some other stories of folks that we interviewed, and we're going to take a look at those and give you some... we're not going to do that now. Someone told me, all right, well, forget that. Or not, whatever. We'll go back. So if you suddenly see a tape come up, you'll know that they found that one and that we're going to air it. Can we show?
I think what was most interesting about it is how we made use of that snow. For the next week, we'd be out there digging underneath this snow and making tunnels. And it was cold enough. It's January, right? In Milwaukee, it's never very warm. And that stuff would stay. We probably were lucky we weren't killed, but we had tunnels in the snow that went sometimes half a block under the snow.
After the snow stopped, we all got all the shovels out. Once I had the family property shoveled out, I made a lot of money shoveling walks all over the place.
Cars were stuck all over the place. In fact, the fact that cars were stalled is really what shut down the streetcar lines. And that, of course, was right after the war when the city of Milwaukee was very, very ill-equipped to handle snow. With the Depression and World War II, they really had not been able to buy up-to-date equipment. In fact, subsequently, when I went to work in the commissioner's office, I was told by some of the old-timers that the Common Council met in emergency session that Saturday morning after the big snow and approved the purchase of more snow fighting equipment than the aggregate of the previous 11 years' budget. So my password always was, nothing meaningful gets done unless a crisis first exists.
Now, this is over at 35th and Burnham. It's fascinating that they put all that money in suddenly into snow removal.
Well, Jim, many politicians have lost their jobs over the years due to lack of snow removal.
Now, we talked a little bit about the equipment, Don, and tell us a little bit more about that. And I think we can go on to another tape, and as we're talking, I think we've got some pictures of the V-plows and some brushes and things.
Right. They ordered some snow throwers. This was the first time I ever saw a snow thrower in my life. And I remember this thing coming down Sherman Boulevard and throwing snow from Sherman Boulevard, from the road, right onto the front of our house, which was set back quite a distance from Sherman Boulevard.
There's some stuff. There's the brushes, right?
Those are on the streetcar. Yeah, that's right.
People had to get the heck out of the way. Did you notice that?
Streetcar track cleaning equipment looked like that. But these were like huge snow throwers that we use today. And they mounted them on the front of their garbage trucks. In fact, they ordered several trucks. I understand that they even commandeered some that were supposed to be heading to another city and brought them to Milwaukee because the situation was so critical here.
Jim, this snow was not wetter than normal. I took a look at the water content of the snow, looking at the weather records, and it was about a 10-to-1 ratio. So it wasn't a super wet snow, but there was just so much of it a long period of time, as Don pointed out, wind gusts of over 50 miles per hour. And the storm was so strong that there was thunder snow, lightning and thunder along with the heavy snow. So quite a storm for people to remember. But again, I emphasize, and I think a lot of the remembrance has to do with, as you say, the lack of snow removal and how it affected people's lives. Because I remember 73. See, to me, my memory, early in Milwaukee, 19, were you still here in 73?
I left
to get out just before the storm.
Just before that happened.
You remember the April 73 storm?
Yes, it was
very wet, over a foot of snow. The town was practically paralyzed, but not for the length of time of the 47 storm.
Well, the stories go on and on that you talk to people, and they'll talk about. I remember one of the bigger neighbor kids, Jackie Gossett, in my neighborhood, came to our house on skis and said, "I'm going to go to the store. Do you need anything?" And hoping that the store would be open. But Don, you said something interesting about milk.
Yes, there was quite a bit of milk available at the dairies, but they had no bottles because normally in those days milkmen would pick up the empties and deliver the full bottles of milk. Well, there was no one to go out and get the empties, and as a consequence they had all of the milk that people wanted but not enough bottles to distribute them. But people did walk for miles to get to a dairy or to get to a bakery or any store that was open to pick up food, staple food.
Now, it was interesting, in reading your book, I found out that one of the ways people stayed literally alive was on the trolley buses and the streetcars.
Yes, because the trolley buses, the trackless trolleys, and the streetcars had the trolleys that were still getting electricity fed into them, so the heat was on, the lights were on. People were not exactly comfortable. It wasn't the Ritz Hotel, but, you know, they could stay alive, okay. But people who were stuck on gasoline buses were in big trouble. First of all, for whatever reason, I can't imagine why they had not put antifreeze in many of the gasoline buses. So that as the weather turned really cold, these things all froze up. They had to cut the lines and let the water drain out, and then they just towed these buses back to the garages and had to do God knows how many millions of dollars of repair work on them. But if you were stuck on a bus and it ran out of gasoline, you were in big, big trouble.
Could you imagine what would have happened if, and which happens sometimes with snowstorms, if the electricity had gone off?
Well, it did.
Were there power outages?
Yes, there were power outages.
A lot of lines went down, yeah.
2 or 3 areas of the city. One large area around Highway 100 and Capitol Drive, and another one on the east side around Webster and Oakland. But other than that, there was no electric outage. There were no major fires. There was one.
There was one.
There was one fire. Yeah. There were no major police involvements where there were robberies or anything like that.
What could happen? You couldn't get to somebody's house to rob it.
And people were nice to weather forecasters. What an era.
There were a lot of good...
Let me point out to you, sir, that has changed.
You know, it was a period, when you think back, it was really a victory of the human spirit. Because, well, there's a story, and I think it's a really neat one. There was a woman who was severely disabled, stuck on a streetcar with just the motorman. And two young fellas were walking along, and they happened to poke their head into the streetcar, and the woman asked if it were possible for them to somehow get her to her house, because she'd been in the streetcar for a day and a half without food and water, and she was partially paralyzed. So these guys, 14-year-old two fellas, went and got a toboggan and put her on the toboggan and took her home. Now, that doesn't sound like much until you realize she lived on 3rd and Locust, and the streetcar was stuck on 14th and National.
Good
So,
heavens.
you know, what is that distance? 6, 7 miles or more?
You hope that we
through
would do that today, but I wonder.
I think we, you know, to be honest with you, I remember from almost every snowstorm in Milwaukee, you always hear about stories of people helping other people.
We are still a community.
Absolutely.
We've got, I think, a shot from West Dallas, if I'm correct on this one, that we can take a look at. And again, we'll talk as we look at this tape. Oh, this is Vliet, I'm sorry. Okay, there it is, Vliet Street. And again, just look at the drifts. Now, this has been shoveled a bit, hasn't it?
Oh, yes. This is probably a week or more after the storm.
Don, how high do you remember the drifts being?
Oh, look
I
at that car there.
I remember
10 feet.
walking along the sidewalks, and the snow was way over my head, way over my head.
Well,
Of course, I was little at the time.
I think it was Bill Jans talked about walking on drifts and going right to the roof of his garage. And in fact, I talked to him, I ran into him a couple of days ago, and he said it was the only time that he can remember doing back-to-back articles on something, columns on something, because he got such a response to his first column about the snowstorm. They did another one just on the follow-up and all the stories that people had. You had another story that really touched me, and I wish you'd share that with us.
Well, I was coming home from school, and with a friend. I was probably the smallest kid in my class, and he was probably one of the largest guys in the class. We were standing on the corner of Sherman and Center, and the light changed, and theoretically we should have been able to cross the street, but the road was so icy. A car came along, and I was to his left, and I noticed the car was sliding. He stepped right in front of the car, and somehow I got the strength to lift this guy right into the air and put him back on the curb, and the car slid right past us, totally out of control. And I shudder to think what might have happened to him if I hadn't been there.
One of my clearest pictures is my parents pulling my brother and me down the middle of streets in Whitefish Bay. Obviously not a car in sight, just these wonderful drifts. Yeah. And for kids, it was probably the best time in the world because the schools closed. That was before we closed schools because it might be cold.
I love that.
You're absolutely right. Kids love weather. You know, I find even to this day, I love weather. I feel like I'm a kid, but kids love weather because of the fact that, you know, they don't worry about, can I drive in it, you know, what kind of hassles are going to make it. They just have fun with it, and they kind of go with nature, which I think is a good attitude, in my opinion.
For years after that, especially when I was in high school and I had an exam coming along, I'd go outside and pray that we'd have another 1947 blizzard and
I
save
ask
me
kids
from...
in school, what's your favorite season? Almost always they say winter.
Really?
Ask that to adults, see what you get around here.
Yes, but that's true because the winters of my childhood always seemed to me to be sparkling snow, sunshine, clear skies, and bright snow, and great fun, and playing with it.
There were some downsides to this whole storm, too.
Oh, yes.
Aside from the 5 people who died, the cost, the financial cost was enormous. They figured the cost at about $75 million in lost wages, in snow removal costs, in commercial businesses that couldn't open up, had to stay closed, etc., plus the cost of buying more snow removal equipment, etc. So it was a pretty expensive snowstorm. Now, I have no idea what $75 million, 1947 dollars would equate to
It
today.
would be a lot.
I'll bet 10 times that amount.
Don, communities have a history sometimes when there's bad snows and they don't remove the snow of changing the politicians. Did that happen at that time?
No, it really didn't. Although the mayor, Mayor Bone, was an elderly gentleman. And I bet he was in his 80s at that time.
And we did get a new mayor the next year.
Mayor
Frank
Zeidler.
Zeidler came in 48,
right,
but I don't think it was
exactly.
on the.
It did not have anything to do with it. There was not the consternation then that there would be.
So we're tolerable to politicians back then along with weathermen.
We were kinder, gentler people. The lucky people were the ones who got into a hotel, a restaurant, or a bar, weren't they?
Right, right. And then there were people who spent 2 days in phone booths, on stairs in hotels, in any place where they could stay warm. It was really, really amazing. If you weren't out of the downtown area by 4 or 4:30 on the first day, that's Wednesday, the 29th, you were stuck. You weren't going to go anywhere. And so that was their plight. And it was a good 2 days worth.
The persistent northeast winds caused a lot of the problems with the drifting. And I mentioned the storm slowed down as it was coming up over Illinois. And when the lows track over Illinois, that's when we get the heavy snows. But that's also when we get the winds off the northeast. And that means real strong winds. And that means that the lake helps to actually increase the wind speed in Milwaukee. And so I think that had a lot to do with the drifts that Don was talking about.
The waves on Lake Michigan were reported to be so high. There was a 25-foot tower that sat on one of the breakwaters, and the waves were going over the top of that 25-foot tower, just to give you some idea of how intense this was.
15 seconds. Could anything like this happen again?
Snow could. We've had storms. In fact, this isn't even a record-breaking snowfall.
That's what I'm wondering.
We've had snow of well over 20 inches.
We're much better
for snow removal.
First of all, Paul would predict it, and we would know well in advance.
Well, on that note, I would like to thank my guests for being with us, and thank you as well. I hope you've enjoyed remembering the snowstorm of 1947. See you next time on I Remember Milwaukee. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Stay tuned for the second part of Antiques Roadshow's visit to Secaucus, New Jersey. Next at 7 here on Channel 10.
Walked right off of there onto a big drift and right down into the backyard.
I remember standing on corners and seeing snowbanks next to me that were higher than I was. And you had to sneak and peek around the corner to make sure there wasn't a car coming.
I remember walking down to First and National, a big drift on top of the, going right over the stop and go light, the pole. I walked right over it. And the 60 viaduct where you walk, you know, the snow was right even with the rail on the side.